The wind howled through the twisted pines surrounding the old Red Hollow ranch, bending the trees like they were bowing to something unseen. Snowflakes danced violently in the air, clinging to every surface, turning the open fields into a white wasteland. Grace Whitlow stood by the window of the ranch house, arms crossed tightly around her chest, eyes fixed on the storm outside. Her breath fogged the glass, but she didn't move. She wasn't watching the weather, she was waiting for something. Or maybe someone. It had been 40 years since the night her father, Tom Whitlow, vanished in a blizzard just like this one. No note. No tracks. Just his favorite horse, a saddle missing from the barn, and the cold silence that followed. The town called it an accident. Some called it abandonment. But Grace never stopped wondering. She never stopped listening to the wind. Tonight felt different. She turned to stoke the fire, the room crackling with warmth, when a distant noise echoed through the storm. A faint whinny, almost swallowed by the wind. Her head snapped toward the sound. There it was again. A horse. Alone. Grace grabbed her coat and storm lantern, boots crunching through fresh snow as she pushed through the barn doors and into the darkness. The wind stung her face, but she followed the sound instinctively. There, near the fence line, stood a lone figure. A horse. Chestnut-colored. Frost clinging to his mane. Trembling. Weak. He didn't bolt when she approached. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if recognizing something deep in her soul. She stopped short, her voice caught in her throat. The horse was old, but powerful. His eyes were wild and wise. And hanging from the end of his thick tail was something she couldn't make sense of. A small leather pouch, barely visible through the frozen strands. Grace reached out, her fingers numb from the cold, and unhooked the pouch. The leather was cracked and worn, but stitched with letters that made her blood run cold. T.W. She stumbled back a step. Tom Whitlow. Her father's initials. The horse let out a low, tired breath, as if he had finally reached where he was supposed to be. Grace clutched the pouch to her chest, her mind racing. Inside, she found an old, folded piece of paper, damp, torn at the edges, and faintly marked with ink. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, revealing a short message. If you're reading this, he found his way home. Her breath hitched. Her heart pounded. She looked up at the horse again. He was no ordinary animal. He was the same horse her father rode into that storm 4 decades ago. The same saddle marks. The same scar over his flank. Boone. How? Why now? And more importantly, what else did he bring back with him? The storm had calmed by morning, leaving the landscape frozen and still, like a memory preserved in glass. Grace sat at the worn oak table in the kitchen, the small leather pouch resting in front of her, beside a cup of untouched coffee. The note lay unfolded, the ink slightly smeared from her damp fingers the night before. She had read it a dozen times, and yet the words kept changing in meaning each time, not in content, but in weight. He found his way home. It didn't make sense. Boone should have been long gone. No horse lives that long. Unless... Ray Harlan, the old foreman, knocked twice before stepping into the kitchen. His boots tracked in snow, and his lined face was twisted with worry. "I saw the horse," he said, eyes scanning the note. "It can't be. That's Boone, isn't it?" Grace nodded slowly. Ray rubbed a hand over his stubbled chin. "I rode with your daddy more years than I can count. I'd recognize that horse in the dark." "But Grace," he hesitated. "Boone's been gone for 40 years." She looked up at him. "And yet here he is." Her voice was quiet, almost disbelieving. "With that pouch. With Dad's initials." She opened it again and pulled out the small paper, but something else was inside, something she hadn't noticed before. Tucked into a hidden flap was a thin silver chain, attached to a pendant shaped like a locket. Her fingers worked it open. Inside was a faded photo. A younger Tom Whitlow holding a baby in his arms. Her, she realized. A photo she had never seen before. Grace felt her throat tighten. Ray leaned closer. Where the hell did that come from? She turned the locket over. Scratched faintly into the back were the words, "Red Hollow will remember." A strange phrase. Not something her father ever said. But it struck something deep inside her, a feeling she couldn't name. Ray stood up straight, his eyes narrowing. "I'm going to check Boone again. Maybe he's got more on him." He walked out the back door, and Grace sat there, staring at the note and locket, her fingers trembling slightly. The kitchen around her seemed smaller, older, filled with ghosts she hadn't invited. How had this horse found his way back to Red Hollow? And why now? Outside, the cold crept under the doors again. The ranch was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wind through the wood beams. Grace reached for the diary she kept tucked in the drawer. It was her mother's, filled with old entries, memories, scraps of conversations. Maybe there was something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But as she flipped through the pages, a loose sheet fell out. One she didn't remember placing there. It had the same handwriting as the note. It wasn't an accident. He knew they were coming. Grace froze. Her heart pounded in her ears. Who was they? The wind had picked up again by the time Ray returned from the stable, brushing snow from his shoulders as he stepped back into the kitchen. His face was pale, and he didn't speak right away, just held something small in his calloused hand. Grace rose from the table, sensing the weight of what he carried. When he opened his palm, she saw a brass key, tarnished and cold, attached to a thin strip of leather. It had been tied beneath Boone's saddle strap, hidden where only someone who knew to look would find it. A key? Grace asked, frowning. To what? Ray stared at it for a long moment. I ain't sure. But it looks like the kind used on old lockboxes. Maybe something from the bunkhouse. Or the tool shed. He hesitated, glancing toward the locket on the table. Or maybe something he buried. Your dad, he always kept things close. Especially toward the end. Grace felt a flicker of something cold crawl up her spine. There was always talk, quiet, uneasy talk, that Tom Whitlow had gotten into trouble before he vanished. Land disputes, money owed, even whispers about a falling out with a man named Luther Maddox. The kind of name folks avoided saying too loudly, especially back then. Maddox had been their nearest neighbor, a rancher with more land, more money, and fewer scruples. He and Tom had once been friends, until something drove them apart. Grace picked up the brass key and studied it. It was heavy in her hand, like it carried a memory no one wanted to remember. "Do you think this has to do with Maddox?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Ray's jaw tightened. "I wouldn't rule it out. Last time your dad rode off, it was after they had words. Nobody knew what it was about, but he was different afterward. Nervous. Always looking over his shoulder." He paused. Maybe this horse showing up now means the past's about to come knocking again. Grace didn't respond right away. Her eyes moved toward the barn, where Boone rested under thick blankets and warm lighting. That horse had crossed mountains, time, and snow to bring a pouch, a locket, a note, and now a key. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. A puzzle her father had left behind, and she was the one meant to solve it. She turned back toward the old hallway that led to her father's former study, a room locked up for decades. Her fingers closed around the key. Maybe it wouldn't fit there. Maybe it would. But something told her the answers wouldn't wait much longer. Somewhere out there, buried beneath years of silence, was a truth someone had tried very hard to forget. And whoever they were, they had waited long enough. The door to her father's study groaned as the key turned in the old lock, metal grinding against metal like it hadn't moved in decades. Grace stood in the dim hallway, her breath catching as the knob gave way. She pushed the door open slowly, revealing a room untouched by time. The air thick with dust, the scent of old paper, tobacco, and something faintly metallic. The curtains were drawn tight, allowing only a thin sliver of light to slice across the desk, where stacks of notebooks, maps, and loose photographs remained as if frozen in place. She stepped inside carefully, like entering a church. Her boots echoed softly on the wooden floor. Everything was exactly how she remembered. The bookshelf with missing volumes, the oil lamp on the corner table, even her father's old leather chair, worn where he used to rest his left elbow. It was eerie, surreal, as if he might walk in at any moment, pick up a pen, and continue writing whatever secrets had consumed him all those years ago. Grace approached the desk, brushing off a thick layer of dust. One drawer was already slightly ajar, and inside she found a journal. Not the kind for daily thoughts, but something more deliberate. It was marked with initials, T.W., same as the pouch Boone carried. She opened it slowly, careful not to tear the aged pages. The first few entries were simple. Notes about weather, ranch finances, local disputes. But as she flipped further, the tone changed. There were names, dates, symbols, warnings. She found repeated mentions of pressure from Luther Maddox, land disputes that went unreported, envelopes with no return address, payments made in cash. It wasn't just ranch rivalry, it was something darker. One entry stood out. Dated just days before he vanished, it read, "He gave me an ultimatum. Walk away, or they'll come for her next. I can't let them touch Grace. If Boone makes it back, it means I failed, or I found another way." The breath left her lungs. Her father had been protecting her, not running. Whatever he was caught in, it wasn't about cattle or land. It was about survival. And Boone. Boone was the messenger meant to return only if something went wrong. But what could have gone so wrong that it took 40 years for the message to arrive? Grace closed the journal and leaned back, the walls around her suddenly too tight. There was a pounding in her ears, from fear, from confusion, from the weight of truths buried too deep for too long. Somewhere, Luther Maddox still lived on the neighboring land. Retired, maybe, but alive. He'd be old now, but he hadn't forgotten. People like him never did. A noise from outside jolted her, the sound of hooves. Boone was stirring again. And something told her he wasn't done delivering messages. The afternoon sun cast long, cold shadows over Red Hollow Ranch as Grace stepped out of the study, clutching her father's journal tight to her chest. The wind had calmed, but the air still carried the weight of something heavy, as if the land itself remembered the secrets buried beneath it. Boone stood in the paddock behind the barn, his eyes locked on something beyond the fence line. Grace followed his gaze, and her stomach tightened. Across the field, just at the edge of the tree line, a man stood motionless. Even at a distance, she recognized him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a crooked stance and a wide-brimmed hat that hadn't changed in decades, Luther Maddox. His presence sent a chill through her veins, deeper than the mountain air ever could. He didn't wave. He didn't move. Just stared across the snow-covered pasture, watching Boone, watching her. Then, as if he'd made his point, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Grace's fingers clenched around the journal. It wasn't just coincidence. He knew. Somehow, he knew Boone had come back. And that meant he'd probably been watching long before today. Her father's words echoed in her mind. They'll come for her next. Had Maddox kept tabs on her all these years? Waiting to see if the past would resurface? Ray Harlan met her halfway across the field, his face grim. "I saw him too," he said without needing to ask. "He's never been one to show up without a reason." You think he saw the horse? Grace nodded. He didn't take his eyes off him. Ray spat into the snow. He's spooked. Boone's not just a reminder. He's proof. Proof your father was telling the truth. Grace looked back toward the paddock. Boone stood tall, alert, his breath visible in the cold air. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a witness. A living piece of the past returned to testify. But testify to what? She had the journal, the locket, the note. And now the man her father feared had returned. Whatever had been buried was starting to claw its way back into the light. That night, as the sky turned ink black and the wind whispered through the eaves of the ranch house, Grace couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire with Boone's saddle in her lap, running her fingers along the worn leather, tracing the stitches. That's when she noticed something. A small seam, slightly raised near the underside. She pulled at it gently, and a thin piece of parchment slid out. Written in the same familiar hand were just 4 words. He's not working alone. Her pulse raced. The enemy wasn't just Maddox. There was someone else, someone closer. The next morning broke in a haze of frost and dread. Grace moved through the ranch house as if the walls had ears, her father's journal clutched tight under her arm. Every creak in the floorboards, every whistle of wind through the cracks now felt loaded with suspicion. Boone's return had shattered the stillness of her world, but it was the message tucked in his saddle that left her breathless. He's not working alone. Someone close had been part of it. Maybe still was. Ray brought in wood for the stove, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. He glanced at her as he set the logs down. You look like you didn't sleep. Grace gave a half nod, not ready to say what she'd found. Not yet. Not until she was sure she could trust him. A thought flickered behind her eyes. Had Ray always been there for her, or had he been watching? I was thinking about something, she said cautiously, sitting at the table. About the night Dad disappeared. Ray paused. What about it? She studied him. You were working that night, weren't you? He nodded slowly. We all were. Storm hit out of nowhere. Your dad rode out around dusk. Told me not to follow. His voice grew quieter. Said he had to settle something once and for all. Grace nodded, pretending to accept the answer, but the tension in her chest didn't ease. Her father hadn't trusted many people. And whoever else was involved, they'd known enough to threaten his family. Back in her father's study, she spread out the journal, locket, note, and the hidden message. One piece didn't fit, a strange map hand-drawn into the back cover of the journal. Not a property layout, but a floor plan of the house. A red X marked near the back pantry. Grace's heartbeat quickened. She moved into the pantry, brushed aside crates of preserves, and began knocking along the baseboards. Hollow. She pried them off with a crowbar, revealing a loose panel beneath the floor. Inside the space was a rusted metal box, locked with a tiny latch that matched the brass key Boone had carried. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a sealed envelope marked, "For Grace, when the truth finds its way home." She opened it slowly. Her father's handwriting filled the page, a confession, written like a man who knew his time was running out. He detailed his conflict with Maddox, who had been laundering stolen money through land deals. But more shocking was the second name mentioned in the letter. Curtis Bledsoe, the former sheriff. A man Grace had trusted her whole life. The snow crunched beneath Grace's boots as she pulled her coat tighter around her and headed toward town. Red Hollow streets were mostly empty that morning, blanketed in fresh white silence. But her mind was anything but quiet. The letter in her coat pocket burned against her side, Her father's final warning. Curtis Bledsoe. The name felt different now. Heavy. Dangerous. The man who once gave her candy as a child, who helped organize her mother's funeral, who hugged her when they declared her father legally dead, had been part of it all. She parked in front of a worn-down house at the edge of town, where the porch sagged and the paint had long since peeled away. This was where Curtis had retired after stepping down as sheriff a decade earlier. Grace climbed the steps slowly, boots thudding like drumbeats. She hesitated, then knocked. Curtis opened the door with a tired look, his silver hair flattened beneath a baseball cap. "Grace Whitlow," he said with a thin smile. "Haven't seen you in years. What brings you out here in the cold?" His voice was calm, too calm. She studied his face, searching for cracks in the mask. "I need to ask you something," she said. "About my father. About the night he disappeared." Curtis's eyes flickered, just for a second, before he stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, the house smelled like coffee and dust. An old police radio sat silent on the table beside a stack of unread newspapers. Grace remained standing. "I found something," she said carefully. "In his things. Letters. Notes. He mentioned you by name." Curtis didn't blink. "He said you were involved with Maddox. That you helped cover something up." Silence stretched between them. The old man exhaled slowly, sat down, and rubbed his hands together like someone bracing for a storm. "I never wanted you to find out," he said finally. "Not like this." Grace's stomach turned. "So it's true." Curtis nodded, shame in every line of his face. "I was young, broke. Maddox had influence, money. He owned judges, land agents. Your father found out he was trafficking stolen horses, laundering money through dummy ranches. Said he had proof, threatened to go public. Maddox came to me. Said to convince Tom to keep quiet or disappear." His voice cracked. "I warned him. I told him to leave town." "But he didn't," Grace whispered. Curtis shook his head. "He rode out that night thinking he could end it. I didn't know Maddox planned to kill him." He looked up, eyes moist. "But I helped cover the tracks. Lied in my report. Buried evidence. I thought I was protecting you. Protecting the town." Grace's hands clenched at her sides. "You didn't protect anyone. You let him vanish. You let my family suffer." Curtis didn't deny it. He only said, "Maddox isn't finished." And Grace knew the real reckoning had just begun. The sky over Red Hollow darkened earlier than usual that evening. Clouds rolled in thick and fast, but it wasn't snow they carried. It was the kind of dry, angry wind that warned of something more dangerous. Grace stood at the edge of her porch, Boone restless behind her, pawing at the ground as if he too sensed what was coming. The revelations of the past few days had cracked everything open. Her father's disappearance, Maddox's threats, Curtis's guilt. And now, the weight of it all pressed down like the low-hanging storm overhead. She hadn't told Ray about Curtis yet. Not fully. Trust was a fragile thing now. Too much had been hidden for too long. But she knew she couldn't face what was coming alone. Grace walked into the barn where Ray was brushing down one of the mares. He looked up, concern written across his weathered face. "We have a problem," she said. "A big one." Ray listened as she laid it out. Curtis's confession, the horse trafficking ring, Maddox's reach stretching far beyond land disputes. When she told him Maddox might have been planning her father's death for weeks, Ray didn't even look surprised. "I always knew he was capable of worse," he said. "But to involve the sheriff? That's deeper than I thought." He paused, wiping his hands on a rag. "If Boone hadn't come back, you might have never known." Grace nodded. "But now we do. And I think Maddox knows that too." Her voice dropped. "I think he's watching." Maybe listening. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small, a wire. Tiny, barely the size of a fingernail. I found this under the edge of the pantry window this morning. Ray's jaw tightened. He's not just watching. He's planning something. Night fell hard over the ranch. Grace didn't sleep. Instead, she sat near the fireplace with the shotgun her father used to keep above the mantel. Boone was restless in the barn, his hooves pacing slowly through the straw. Around midnight, the wind shifted again, and the scent of smoke hit her. She bolted to the porch. In the distance, near the tree line bordering Maddox's land, a red-orange glow pulsed behind the snow-laced pines. Flames. Controlled for now, but spreading fast. Grace's heart dropped. Fire in winter was rare, unnatural, and intentional. Ray ran up behind her, out of breath. I just saw men moving near the southern fence line. They're not ours. Grace looked at the flames inching closer and the shadows beyond them. Maddox wasn't trying to scare her anymore. He was coming to finish what he started. The fire moved with terrifying purpose. It snaked through the underbrush like a predator, licking at tree trunks, devouring dried pine needles and broken twigs left by autumn's wind. Grace stood at the south fence line, shotgun in hand, eyes fixed on the dark forms shifting just beyond the glow. Boone snorted and paced behind her, uneasy but loyal. Ray stood to her right with his rifle, the two of them silhouetted by the flickering orange light now reflecting off the snow, an eerie mix of heat and cold. From the woods, a voice called out, deep, slow, unmistakable. "Grace Whitlow, step away from that fence. This doesn't concern you anymore." It was Maddox. She didn't flinch. "You're 40 years too late for threats, Luther," she shouted back. "Whatever you started with my father ends right here." Silence followed. Then footsteps. Heavy ones. A group of men stepped into the clearing, faces shadowed by hats and smoke. Maddox led them, older but still broad and commanding, eyes sharp and cruel beneath his weathered brow. He carried a pistol on his hip, one hand resting casually near it. "You should have burned that journal," he said flatly. "Could have lived out your days in peace, like your mother. But you had to dig. And now, everything your daddy died to bury is coming up again." He stepped closer. "You don't know what you're messing with, girl." Grace raised the shotgun a little higher. "He didn't bury it. You did. And I'm digging it up." Behind her, Boone let out a sudden sharp neigh, a warning. Ray whispered, "They're flanking us." Grace turned her head just enough to see the movement. Two men slipping through the trees on either side. They were trying to surround the barn, the house. Maddox wasn't just bluffing. He was going to torch everything. The ranch, the evidence, and anyone in his way. Grace took a slow breath, heart pounding. "I don't want blood, Maddox," she called. "But I'm not afraid of it either. Not anymore." Maddox laughed, not with humor, but with disdain. "You think you're your father's daughter?" He was soft, naive, thought justice meant something. Grace didn't blink. "He died for what was right. You're just trying to survive what's left." Ray raised his rifle. "We've called the state police," he bluffed. "You've got 2 minutes to leave this land or we won't wait for sirens." The moment stretched tight as a pulled wire. Maddox's eyes darted, not at Grace, but at Boone. The horse stood tall behind the fence, eyes locked on the man who had once ridden alongside Tom Whitlow, then betrayed him. "You always thought that horse was special," Maddox muttered. Grace narrowed her eyes. "He was. He still is. And he remembers you." Then, in the fire's glow, Maddox's hand moved toward his gun. And everything exploded into motion. The crack of gunfire tore through the night, echoing off the hills like thunder. Grace dove behind the fence post as Ray returned fire, his rifle spitting sparks into the darkness. Boone reared, letting out a furious neigh, hooves striking the frozen ground. Maddox's men scattered in the confusion, some ducking for cover, others retreating into the trees. But Maddox himself stayed rooted, crouched low behind a fallen log, gun in hand, face lit by the flames crawling ever closer to the edge of the pasture. Smoke thickened the air, stinging Grace's eyes as she crawled through the snow toward the barn. She had one goal: get to the evidence box hidden in her father's study. If Maddox succeeded in burning down the house, decades of truth would vanish with it. Behind her, Ray shouted something, but the roar of the fire drowned it out. Boone stayed close, circling the barn like he knew exactly what was at stake. Inside the house, embers floated like ghosts through the hallways. The fire had breached the kitchen window, flames licking at the curtains. Grace ran to the study, coughing through the smoke, and grabbed the metal box from the false floor beneath the pantry. She tucked it under her arm, wrapped in a wool blanket, then stumbled back outside just as part of the porch collapsed behind her with a crash of splintering wood and sparks. Back at the barn, Maddox emerged from the smoke, gun raised, face twisted in rage. "Give me the box, Grace," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "You don't understand what's in there. It'll ruin everything." Grace stood her ground, box in one hand, shotgun in the other. "That's the idea." Maddox stepped closer. "This land, this town, it was never yours to protect. Your father tried, and look what it got him." She didn't answer. Boone moved between them, his breath steaming in the cold air, positioning himself like a shield. Maddox aimed, not at Grace, but at the horse. In that instant, time slowed. Grace didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and Maddox stumbled backward, collapsing into the snow with a look of disbelief frozen on his face. He gasped once, then lay still. The flames continued to roar behind them, but help arrived moments later. Neighbors, fire crews, and a county deputy who had received a tip from Ray earlier that evening. By dawn, the fire was contained, the men who fled were in custody, and Grace stood at the edge of the smoldering ruins of her childhood home. The box had survived. The journal, the photos, the letters, they were all intact. As the sun rose over Red Hollow, casting golden light on the snow-covered hills, Grace looked at Boone. His coat was singed in places, but he stood proud, still strong, still watching over her. Her father's truth had finally come home, and with it came peace.